Well, hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Great to see you again. Welcome back to Path to Abundant Living. Ryan Ruff here, your host and moderator. But as always, I've got my right-hand men, and that's Matt Nordman and Scott Morrison of Morrison Nordman Wealth Management standing by. They'll be jumping aboard here in just a moment. But I want to frame up today's conversation. As many of you know that are frequent listeners or viewers of the show, we typically like to tackle these wealth management discussions. But also, in the last handful of episodes, we've been bringing on some just awesome guests from the professional network of Matt and Scott to talk about their unique expertise and what they bring to the table, not just themselves, but also what they bring to the table for that intersection of life and wealth management as a whole. And boy, do we have a great guest that's going to be joining us here today on the show. Today's episode is really entitled Habits of the Top 1%, Timeless Lessons Learned from Sports' Greatest Champions. And today on the show, joining us, we have sports psychologist and performance coach, Dr. Rick Jensen. He's worked through life lessons that we can learn from some champions that he's worked alongside in professional sports. Dr. Rick is a business coach, a sports psychologist. He's also an author who has just had the pleasure of working with some of the top athletes across the top sports all throughout the world. Dr. Rick's golf clients have combined to win 33 major championships, and in tennis, he's trained champions of all four Grand Slam championships. He's been featured on ABC, ESPN, CNN. I could go on and on and on. So boy, are we excited to have Dr. Rick joining us here today. But before we bring him out and get into the nitty gritty of the conversation, let's say hi to the guys. Matt, Scott, good to see you this morning. How we doing?
Ryan, great to see you. Professor, good to see you as well.
You as well, Matt. Hi,
Fellas, we got
Ryan.
good to see you as always, guys. And we got Dr. Rick Jensen on board today. I know we've had this date circled on our calendar for a little while. Matt, why don't you frame it up for our audience? Why Dr. Rick? Why today of all days?
So, why today of all days? Well, so had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Rick at an event earlier this year, and the people that he has worked with, the top of the top. I mean, you say top 1%, we're talking the top 1/10 of 1% or smaller. And we're saying, okay, what are those attributes, habits, things that they do, tactics, strategies, all those things? What is it that they do that we can take in our own life or our business and then excel, maybe not to that same level, but why not at that same level? I said, man, he would be fantastic. I had the pleasure to speak with him. And I said, oh yeah, we have to get him on the show because again, his not only the stories that he has to tell about the people that he's worked with, but just all those things that we talk about, those strategies, tactics, habits, what are they doing and what can we learn and take from them?
No, I love it. I love it. So with that being said, Dr. Rick, thank you so much for carving some time out of your busy schedule to join us, and welcome to Path to Abundant Living.
Thanks for having me. I'm just so excited to finally do this. We've been talking about it for a while, so glad the day is here.
Very, very excited. So I'm going to jump in real quick, Dr. Rick. So over the years, you've worked with, again, like we've talked about, some of the top, if not the top at the time in their sports, golf, tennis, different things like that. And you've coached other top business professionals and executives. Can you speak to, for a bit about what is it that these high achievers all have in common across all these different sports, business, all these different areas?
You probably just said it, Matt. The number one thing you just said, frankly, in the way you framed that question is high achieving is there's as I'm a psychologist by training, and so one of the things you're taught when you start working in the world of professional sports business is a concept called achievement motivation, just meaning why does somebody do what they do? Why do they get up every day? Why do they engage in either the sport that they're in or the business that they're in? And there's a certain set of people that their operating motive, kind of the underlying fuel underneath what they do is achievement motivation. They have a need to see how far they can go. They have this desire for mastery to see how good they can get. So when you look in pro sports, these are people that obviously they're gifted athletically, but what underlies that gift is not, the research is really clear that they're not necessarily born with the gift. They might be born with a certain, Shaquille O'Neal's going to have a certain size advantage over other people. He's born with that. But the ability to train and to achieve and try to strive to mastery is really what underlies that. If you take that as kind of the burning fuel that's inside of these people, then there's what I would argue is a will to work. They have to put in a certain amount of work to develop skill, to develop strength, to develop speed, flexibility. No different than the two of you. I mean, when you think about just your practice and building your practice and the impact that you have on others, you may have the achievement motivation to do that, but you've got to show up every day. You've got to meet with people. You've got to do the reviews. You've got to take the time to build your knowledge and your certifications and your skill set. So that will to work is there. And so someone could be motivated, but if they don't put in the work, and I would say they're going to kind of fizzle out and they're not going to get to the top of the game. I could stack on top of that will to work is a concept that in sports science we refer to as deliberate practice. So it's not just the fact that they'll practice for 8, 10 hours a day. It's that I would say my specialty is very much in how deliberate is each hour of practice. And by that I mean if they're going to spend an hour working, they get an hour of production out of that work. And again, that's business people as well as athletes. It's a matter of, do you spend time on the things that are most important, that most correlate with results, or are you getting caught up every day in what I call necessary non-essentials? And everyone on this call, listening to this call, can relate to those days where you worked the whole day and you felt at the end of the day you just weren't productive. You didn't get anything done. And that's kind of that feeling we have in our gut, like, God, I feel like I just wasted so much time today, even though I was very busy. And the best of the best athletes, they've learned to kind of they have an intolerance for that. They're not going to spend time on things that are not producing results. That it doesn't mean these things aren't necessary, but I always say, like, for instance, like the top players I work with on tour, whether it's tennis or golf, they're not booking their hotel rooms. Has to happen. It just they don't need to be doing it. They're not calling sponsors and dealing with what shirt do I wear at this tournament on this day. There's activities that need to be done that they delegate to others so that they can really spend their time practicing and playing golf, practicing and playing tennis that way. And probably the last step of that is they're very systematic or routine oriented. So once they know I need to spend this much time on putting, on chipping, I need this much time in the gym, I've got to take this much time resting and recovering, and I've got to get to this tournament for practice rounds. They have routines that are just like clockwork. So they know I get up every day at 5:30. I'm in the gym from 5:30 to 7:30. At 7:30, I grab some breakfast. I'm at the golf course by 8:15. And then they've got their routines that kind of guide their behavior each and every day. And that's really, again, I can speak oftentimes about how athletes do that, but the top performers I've seen in business, frankly, do all of those same things. They're just doing it in a sales organization. They're doing it in a wealth management organization. They're doing that in a manufacturing organization. It's just a different environment with the same attributes.
It's fascinating as someone who has golfed a little bit, right? You go to the range and the difference between the one thing you talked about, the deliberate practice, or having those habits of, I'm just going to go beat a bucket of balls for an hour, or no, specifically I'm going to work on chipping, putting, or wedge game, makes a significant difference. And again, not trying to equate, but you can see whether it's in the sports world or in the business world, having those habits and routines and deliberateness and that mental toughness to say, okay, what's the old saying is, what got you here won't get you there, right? It's like, okay, I need to change things and be specific about it. So yeah, it's fascinating to hear.
Many of us, Dr. Rick, obviously we only get to see the byproduct of all this hard work. We see it either on television, we read about it. We don't have that intimate interaction that you've had with some of these athletes and professionals. What do you see when you're with them spending? What are they spending their time on actually doing?
The short answer is the things that are most important. I'll share a story. This is going back years, but in mid 1990s, Greg Norman. Greg Norman was the #1 player in the world from like 85 to 95. And I was on the range with him 1995. And I asked him at the time, I said, why do you think you're dominating? He had been dominating the game for about a decade. He was the Tiger Woods of the time. And I said, why do you think you've been dominating this game for the last 10 years? And he pointed at his chest and he just kind of puts his finger in his chest and he says, right here, pointing at his heart. And I said, well, what do you mean by right here? He says, I want it more. And that's that achievement motivation that I was referring to before. And I said, you want what more? And he says, I want to be number one more than anybody you know. Nobody wants it like I do. Well, at the time, I worked with a lot of guys on tour, and I didn't agree with it. I was like, look, I work with plenty of guys out here. They certainly want it. They wish you would go away so they could take your place. I said, so I can't believe it's want that is really the difference maker. And he looks at me and he goes, well, they don't want it like I do. And I said, yeah, they do. I'll go get them. Wait right here. Watch how many guys I would get. I'll get a line of guys who want it. And he looks at me and he goes, well, they don't do with their want what I do with my want. And I said, well, be specific. What do you mean by that? And he pointed at the ground at the time and at a pile of balls that were on the range. And he says, beat golf balls. He says, there's not one guy out here who hits more balls than I do. He says, I hit more balls in a day. I hit more balls in a month. He goes, and I know I've hit more balls in my lifetime than any of these guys out here. I said, be specific. How many days a week do you actually hit balls? And he said, every day. Every day. He goes, unless I'm in recovery mode when I'm not playing golf, I hit balls every day. He goes, then I'll take a break for 10 days to 2 weeks so I can recover and start that all over again. I said, what time do you get to the range to start hitting balls? He says, 20 minutes before light, like it was a time on his watch. And I'm like, what? He goes, 20 minutes, always 20. I said, well, why 20? And he goes, he says that's when the light shows up. He goes, you don't waste the day hitting balls. He said you don't waste the day doing something less important than working on your game when there's light out. And I said, so what time you're getting there 20 minutes before light? He goes, yes. And I said, well, why 20 minutes before light? And he looks at me and he goes, stretching. He goes, my stretching routine takes exactly 20 minutes. I do it along the front bumper of my car, in the parking lot, in the dark, with my headlights on. And he says, and then I finish and I get to the range he said, so I can start the day. And he said it almost like once I get to the range, the sun's allowed to come up. And then we can start practicing. It was incredibly odd. The key in that, Scott, to what you said is I asked him, I said, so now how long are you going to be out there? He goes, I'm out there till I can't see anymore. And I said, well, what do you spend your time working on? And he said to me, he goes, I work on the parts of my game that cost me the most shots in competition. It was almost like that was his mantra. He said, you got to know what parts of the game are most important, and of those parts of the game, which ones are costing you the most shots, the most outcomes. And that, frankly, is the definition of deliberate practice. Deliberateness means I'm getting production out of the hours that I put in to work every day. And so his idea and others, Tiger was that way, Annika was that way. I did some work with Nicholas years ago. I was the sports psychologist for his tour in Florida, and Jack was that way. They talk very similarly in the sense of if I'm going to be on the range for an hour, I get 8 hours of production out of it. Really interesting. Mini tour players, satellite tour players in tennis, they're not that way. And if you think of amateurs like us, we go to the range, we spend half the time socializing. Right. It just half the time just kind of fiddling around. Someone walks up, we talk to them for a while. We're not getting a ton of production out of that time. And I think that's the difference maker.
Well, it's fascinating to hear that, we know we need to work on those things that we need to work on, right? Whether it's, okay, I need to work on the driver, the wedge, the, short game, mid irons, whatever it is. But it's easier to say, okay, when I'm smoking the driver, like I love to see that driver, like just a nice high draw, right? Well, yeah, that's fine. You're doing that fine. Now go work on the thing that you're not doing well, right? And that's where, but it's easy, right, to do that, right? I mean,
It's
but Go
It's an
ahead.
ego boost, right, Matt? It's an ego boost. So if you sit there and you're great at driving, you can show off on the range because people are like, wow, that's amazing. And frankly, you're almost showing off to yourself about how good you are, but that's not necessarily where you're giving up shots, right? That's oftentimes my role with a player is to kind of analyze the deeper statistics that underline their performance and be able to identify the core sources of where those numbers are coming. So if they're spending too much time hitting driver, it's me rerouting the practice and really saying, let's spend a little bit more over here doing putting. For some, it's even outside the range. They're not fit enough. Greg, I remember asking Greg, I'm like, so you're out there all day. Um, and I said, where do you go once it gets dark? And he says, I go to the gym. I have 2 hours of training still to do every night. He says, so I train 2 hours a day, probably 5, 6 days a week. And he made it a point to tell me, but I never do that during light. Light, he would say, light is for hitting golf balls. Um, but yet he said, but many people, they're not fit enough to spend the entire day hitting balls. He says, so if you don't work out, you could never be fit enough to kind of sustain the workload. So sometimes you're rerouting somebody to to a fitness person or to just get to the gym. There's many athletes, I have to teach them how to rest. There's times I have to go, you need to take a break. You're burnt out. You've played 9 events in a row without a break. Your body's starting to break down. So it's really trying to define what are the contributors to the outcome. And again, referring back to business, I think that's true for good business executives, good business managers, or professionals at any level. They understand if I spend time doing these things, we drive more sales, we drive more revenue, we're more profitable, we create a better culture. The things that they're really intending to get out of that work, they have a keen sense of how to spend that time.
One is, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's also to make sure that you don't have this significant imbalance in one area or the other, right? It's like, hey, if Greg were to just focus on driving the golf ball, he wouldn't do this, or spending all his day outside or inside or whatever. It's like making sure that you are not so imbalanced in these different areas. Is that
Yeah,
fair to
yeah.
say?
Imbalance doesn't work. Like you probably heard me speak about it down in Florida, Matt, but I oftentimes refer today, like for golfers that are listening to this podcast, they'll have heard the phrase, you drive for show, you putt for dough. Like in golf, we've said that for since I've been alive, golfers have said that. There's actually not truth in that. The reality is the number one category in golf is driving. Driving is the highest, the quality of your driving, distance plus direction, those things, what we call total driving, is the primary correlate to outcomes in golf. The best ball strikers on tour are the winners on tour. That's Scotty Scheffler, that's Rory McIlroy, that's Shoffley. And when you think of these players, they're great from tee to green, particularly off the tee. If you actually looked at the top putters in the world, they're probably outside the top 100 in terms of money won on tour. There's not a correlate. And it doesn't mean that putting's not important. It means that putting doesn't differentiate people on the PGA Tour. They're all good putters. And the difference between the best putter and the worst putter doesn't make that much of a difference because they all, once they're on the green, are relatively good putters. But ball striking from tee to green, in particular off the tee, truly does separate people. So, Matt, to your point, it's a combination of balance, but there is a little imbalance in the sense of I'll say to players that, hey, you're already a sufficient putter. Let's learn to strike the ball better. You've got to be better in the categories that are more important.
Yeah, to your point, like most people who maybe even just tangentially follow golf have heard of Rory and have heard of Scotty Scheffler. Not many people have heard of Denny McCarthy, even though he's a great player, but arguably the best putter on tour, and that
Top
all
putter
tour
in the
players will
world,
say,
right?
right?
Exactly
But
right.
most people he's not a household name like the others. So, so speaking of Tiger Woods' dominance, in the early 2000s, and you've spent so much time in professional golf, why was he so dominant? And then, what changed and caused him to decline so much? Obviously, he's had some injuries, but or the car accident, but what do you see there?
Well, probably all the things we've been talking about thus far would Tiger is the poster child for that from the time he was a junior golfer. You talk about his achievement motivation, his will to work, his passion for just golf itself. He just enjoyed golf. There's a lot kind of written and talked about in terms of his dad's kind of pushing him, but his dad really was there more as a support structure. And I think Tiger's own desire to be a champion in golf was set early on. So I think he had the attributes certainly to be great. He had the work ethic. Tiger's the most fit golfer I've ever been around. I mean, if you would see Tiger in a gym without a shirt, he looks like Marvin Hagler. I mean, he would look like a professional boxer, is how fit he was. He would run several miles every day. I'd be at tournaments and you'd see Tiger coming in again at a tournament, in a tournament round. He'd go jogging in the morning, first thing in the morning. If you were down in the gym, he was going to be in the gym working out, and he would have just run 5 miles prior to doing that on a day of a tournament round. Incredibly fit. Early on, he had a great relationship with his coach. Like, he worked with Butch Harmon right out of college. They started working together when Tiger was at Stanford, and Butch was a mentor, was a coach, was really there for him. He also then Butch introduced him to Keith Clevens, who was one of the top fitness trainers. Talk about boxing. Keith trained Mike Tyson. He also started training Tiger Woods early on in his career. So Tiger had a great camp behind him, worked with Fluff Cowan, one of the best caddies in the game. So he just kind of built this team around him, had the work ethic, had the discipline, and just was the best player in the game by far in terms of skills. Skills were there first, mental toughness on top of that, a great team, dominated. I would say if Tiger has an Achilles heel, it's what I refer to as relationship management. The ability to sustain relationships is important for anybody, but particular people in high performance arenas, because you need support systems, you need structure, and you don't want to have to change things very often. Tiger dominated through the 1999, 2000, 2001, when he was winning, when he won the Tiger Slam, all 4 majors in a row. I think he won the US Open in 2000 by 15 shots. And then in 2002, 2003, he had a falling out with Fluff, his caddy, and he fired him. He had a falling out with Butch Harmon, and he fired him. And those 2 components went away. And then Tiger subsequently hired Hank Haney. And I can remember Hank taught a very different swing than Butch Harmon. I can remember Hank, when Tiger was dominating the game. I was doing ESPN golf schools at the time. I was down in Texas with Hank. We were shooting a commercial. And at dinner, I said to Hank, was good friends with Tiger because Hank taught Mark O'Meara. And Mark O'Meara and Tiger were very good friends at the time. And Tiger and Hank and Mark used to play golf. Well, Tiger was starting to explore working with Hank as his coach. And I remember Hank talking to Hank about, hey, what do you think of his game? And he kind of started saying that he didn't have a great golf swing. And I was like, how can you say a guy that just won all 4 majors and he dominated the stats? I'm going, what do you mean he doesn't have a good golf swing? And he went through and he's like, well, the club gets across the line at the top. It's a little shut, gets stuck behind him on the way down. He goes, and I'm like, yeah, but if that's those things produce that result, why would you mess with it? And he kind of used my own language. He was like, well, you're making my point. Imagine how dominant he would be if he actually fixed all those things that were wrong. And I said, so you're going to change those things? He goes, without a doubt. And they did. So the next few years was kind of a slump for Tiger. 2004, 5, he didn't play as well. And to Tiger's credit, he learned a different swing under Hank Haney and mastered it and got back to the top of the game 2007, 8, 9. But then in 2009, he had a falling out again. He had gotten married. He met Elin, his wife, 2003. What the media talked about was that Elin chasing him down the driveway on Thanksgiving in 2009 with a 6-iron or whatever it was and crashing his car at the end of the driveway. And then they had a falling out, and kind of Tiger's infidelity all came out in the news. So there was another relationship issue that broke down, and Elin and he split. At the same time, Tiger also, again, he was working with Steve Williams as his caddy now. He fired Steve Williams. They split. He also let go. He fired Hank. Hank will say he fired Tiger, but the two of them split as well. and Tiger let go of Keith Clevens, his fitness trainer. So in 2009, his wife, his caddy, his coach, his fitness trainer, all gone. Just relationship shot. And then Matt, to your point, he was injured. If you remember, he kind of had a knee problem
Yeah.
at Torrey Pines in 2009. And so with injury and then kind of blowing up your entire player support team, I don't think we've ever seen the same guy. He hired Sean Foley after letting go of Hank, and he worked with Sean maybe 18 months. And then he released Sean and he started working with Chris Como. Maybe they stayed together for a year and then he released him. So for me, it always comes back to relationships. You have to sustain the team around you. If you look at some of the best players in Nadal, one of the greatest tennis players we've ever seen, Rafa's had the same team behind him since he was a junior tennis player in tennis. When he's basically retiring at this point in time or starting to exit, he's got the same team in place from his physio to his coaches to his agent. They're all the same people in his camp. Jack Nicklaus, I said to Jack, he worked with a guy named Jack Grout. I asked him, when did you meet Jack Grout? He said, when I was 10 years old. I said, when did you stop working with Jack Grout? He said, when he passed away. He goes,
Wow.
he was my only coach his entire life. Arnold Palmer told me he had one coach in his entire life was his father, was his only coach in his entire life. Annika Sorenstam played, her coach was Henri Rice. He was her junior Federation golf coach back in Sweden. When she retired, she lived in Orlando, and so did he. He was her coach her entire life. And Ryan, to your point earlier, what we see kind of behind the scenes is not we don't get a look at what goes on behind the scenes, but that's kind of what you start to see once you're around them and up close in person.
And
Sure.
so in those relationships, is there, in your experience, have you seen someone who will actually, I don't want to say hold them accountable, but kind of hold them accountable at times and not just be the yes person in their life, right? Someone that'll say, hey, you know what? You're great at this, but you need to work on this, and know that they have that strong relationship that, hey, I really want what's best for you in this situation right now. And I'm going to I can sugarcoat it or I can just give it to you straight. And they have those relationships.
You would hope so, but I think that's the challenge, particularly in individual sports. In individual sports, when you're working for the player because the player's paying you. Maybe their agency pays you, but basically it's coming out of the player's paycheck. So your boss is the person that you're trying to hold accountable. And I think then it just comes down to integrity. It's the integrity of the professionals around. I think for Tiger, one of the things that really hurt him was his father passed away. And when his father was that person that could hold his feet to the fire and maybe say the things to him that maybe those who were making, hundreds of thousands of dollars off a Tiger would not be willing to say. I feel like that's why I have a job. I kind of operate that way. I'm willing to say things to players that other people are not willing to say. I have enough clients. If I lose one client, and frankly, as a psychologist, you can't even release who your clients are. So it's not like I benefit a lot by marketing who my clients are. My clients aren't posted on my website. So I don't know that I get a lot of, other than maybe saying they've won X number of majors or they've won Grand Slams. I'm not necessarily using my relationships with players as a marketing tool. Golf teachers are, tennis instructors are. I remember I had a player on the WTA tour in tennis years ago that she was top three in the world through most of her career, was maybe playing a little worse, went down to like top 5, 6, 7, but still a top 10 player on tour. I would be practicing with her and her coach, and we'd be on the court, and she just had no motivation to even be there. She wasn't playing as well. And at one point, I just kind of had a conversation with her. I'm like, are you enjoying this game anymore? Like, do you even enjoy it? And she's like, I hate it. She's like, I don't really enjoy it at all. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? Why are you still playing? She had millions of dollars in the bank, didn't need the game. And she's like, I'm just good at it. Why, who would ever quit the game when you're playing at the level I play at? I'm like, You would. You have a whole another life to move on. What are the other things that you would want to do? And she had unreal interests outside of tennis, that she was almost like, one day I'm going to do these things. I'm like, well, one day could be now. Why wouldn't you just do that? And she's like, no one's ever said anything like that to me. Well, do you think we could do it? And we did. We planned her exit, and she exited within 6 months. She was so excited that somebody was asking her about planning her next life. But her agent never spoke to me again. The guy was so angry that, I mean, I blew up. I imagine how much income came out of the agency's pocket by me suggesting that and facilitating that happen. And those are the inner workings, Matt, like that, why I think many people won't recommend some of the things that would even be in the best interest of the player.
But again, that's a testament to you and to professionals who are willing to say, look, this, yeah, I might even suffer financially for this, but this is in your best interest to do this, whatever this thing is. And for this person, it was, no one had ever said to her, you don't have to do this anymore. You can do these other things. Because probably in this situation, like you said, for the agent, there's just the money train's moving too fast and they don't want it to stop. So.
You and Scott deal with it very similar. I've been around a lot of financial advisors through the business work I do, right? I mean, it's no different than the two of you when you talk about helping clients, give and spend fearlessly. When you talk about giving, and now you're going to take a certain amount of money and give it away, and now you're not managing that money, and that impacts the pay that the two of you get through your wealth management firm. You kind of like at the core of relationships is, putting the client first and what they're really looking to do. It's one of the things I think we're trained as psychologists. I'm sure you're trained that as financial advisors. And so when you're doing that, there's a point where, right, I think there's many wealth management firms would be like, hey, wait a minute, if that person goes and creates an endowment or a foundation or a charity or a scholarship, and they take $2 million to do that, well, how's that impact our revenue as a firm? Right. And many would not make that choice. It comes down to integrity. And hopefully the clients on the other end are shopping for that. I think that's what they're looking for from advisors like the two of you, from advisors like me.
Yeah. Well, and the other advisor on this call does have a little history in the psychology department as well.
Oh gosh, don't go there again. It's been too long to give me any more credit for
that. He's very humble, but he has a master's degree and spent 10 years working with at-risk youth. So he does have some knowledge. Yeah.
One of the things, the common theme though that I'm getting with all of this discussion, I mean, obviously it's the discussion so far has been dominating around, professional athletes and things like that. But the takeaways I'm getting for myself and Matt, I think about how we've grown our business, how we've, we're going on our 30th year. I mean, getting close to having worked together for 30 years. So it's like, there's a point where you can kind of, your dance partner, and yet we still can challenge each other as business partners and know each other's weaknesses. And, there's that yin and yang sometimes going on between the two of us where we know one of us can do some things better than the other, and lean on each other's, strengths and try to avoid some of the weaknesses. But then with our clients as well, that whole conversation about working on those things that you're weak at, because it's so easy to fall into a pattern of, hey, I found something to say that resonates with people, and then I continue with that without really looking for the next challenge. What's the thing that's going to take the business to the next level? Or do I just get comfortable with where we're at? And so I just hear, surrounding yourself with people who will hold you accountable, surround yourself with winners, surround yourself with people who've been there and done that and can take you to the next level. It kind of leads to the next question is, you've worked with so many people in the individual sports like golf and tennis, and yet you mentioned that they still have a team sport in their mind because they want to surround themselves with winners. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm a member of what we in sport we'll call it the player support team. If you watch television, they might call it the entourage, right? But it is the people who are underneath in support roles for the player. So even though they're individual sports, as I mentioned before, if you looked at Coco Gauff or Nadal or Djokovic, you're going to see in the background a coach, a physio, oftentimes a movement specialist, a racket stringer or a club fitter, a fitness person, a sports psychologist, an agent, a spouse. There's quite a number of people that are on that player support team. For me, one of the roles I always want to play is I want to almost quarterback that team. Oftentimes those teams are in silos, but bringing that team together and kind of have an integrated solution that best supports that player is a role that I can fill when other people aren't going to do that. Coaches can do that, but oftentimes they don't. Many times the coaches are concerned about the service motion or someone's golf swing or their putting stroke. And it'll, again, creates opportunity for me to come in and try to bring that integrated approach into that. When there's disruption in that team, that takes energy away from the player. The player really wants to trust that, hey, the foundation that sits beneath me as I'm up here performing at an elite level needs to be sound and secure. And they have to have trust in that foundation so that they can kind of do what they're really designed to do, which is to perform at an elite level. I think of the role that just the fact that the two of you found each other in wealth management probably was because you provided complementary skill sets to one another that benefited the client. Ultimately, your primary objective is to spend time with clients, right? That's at the end result, your performance is the impact you have on the end client. So over time, you two could articulate it better than me. You've also surrounded yourself with other partners. So whether those are on the mutual fund side or the insurance side or estate planning attorneys and various tax specialists, wealth management is not just me having access to the two of you. It's the portal that you provide me access to that you've already vetted for me. And now I don't have to do that as a client. I can go live my life. I can be with my kids. I can run my family foundation. I can engage, I can keep running my business because I have a foundation of people like the two of you underneath you. I've always said, to me, it's the value of advice. The value of advice is not just, hey, here's how much money to put into a 401k so one day you can retire. It's all the other intangibles that come up as life happens, as someone in my family has an illness, as I lose a job, as I get a divorce, if I have these things going, for me to be able to rely on trusted advisors, that's incredibly valuable. That's the role I play with athletes. I think the two of you probably identify quite well with that in the work that you do.
Very much so.
It must be something to do with the background that we both had coaches, both had fathers as coaches, both college basketball coaches. And so
Interesting.
The whole athletic part of it does resonate with both of us. But I think the one thing we've learned is that it's some of those life skills through the competition, through the sports and the athletics that have successfully bled into the financial services business and the planning that we do.
Well, again, like you were alluding to, Scott, and Dr. Rick, you said is having that team, right? We know this is the area that we are the experts in, and hey, do we need to bring in the tax strategy expert or the estate planning expert or the charitable giving, right? The foundation, all those different things, or in the event, there is a divorce or a sickness or whatever it is, it's surrounding ourselves and our clients with that entire team, like you said, so you can focus on what is most important and what it is that you want to achieve or have happen in your life.
Dr. Rick,
Go ahead,
I've got just a quick, I guess it's not a quick question, but it is a very interesting area that I want to delve into given your experience. We've talked about, shoring up the sides of somebody's game to be able to dominate. And of course, having that, that network, that team around somebody to help lift them up so that they can see continuous success. But when we're talking about an individual sport like golf or tennis, there's not a whole lot of fingers to be pointed except at yourself. So I'd love to actually look at the flip side of the coin from dominance and look at, losing, choking, just those tough moments in these athletes' careers that can sometimes even define them, kill careers, so on and so forth. What have been some of your experiences working with clients, being, a fly on the wall to some of these situations where you look at an athlete who maybe at one point in time was dominant, went through a tough loss, maybe choked, and had a tough outcome, and trying to rebound. I just love to get your take on this side of athletics. It's not the fun side to talk about, but it's an important side to talk about.
Well, as a sports psychologist, it's certainly the presenting issue very often. As soon as someone experiences a significant choke, whether their caddy, their spouse, their coach, oftentimes be like, I think this is in your head. And many people will conclude that. Then that's certainly the referral I or someone like me is going to get. It's that moment where, Rory McIlroy recently kind of three putted 2 holes coming down the stretch to lose another major, So what causes that? Interesting, Ryan, what I found, and as a sports psychologist, I would benefit by most of those things being mental because my toolbox is full of how do you deal with the attention and the anxiety and the pressure of coming down the stretch in the moment when the pressure increases. Because there's certain things in terms of managing your heart rate, managing your thought process, managing your attention, not focusing on the score, that are mental skills. Believe it, I wrote a book in golf called Easier Said Than Done. It's a real easy read. It was really written for amateurs to kind of understand, are they choking or not? The working title for the book was actually "You're Not Good Enough to Choke." It just was a mean title, so we didn't use it because it was just mean. But the message in the book is very much that choking, what we see at, when someone misses some putts coming down the stretch or hits a couple drives out of bounds, we think of it as a choke, and I get referrals for it and start that process of identifying. But the key in that is identifying, was it your mind, your thought process, your attention control, your anxiety, your heart rate causing that? Or was it that you had what I call a weak link that couldn't sustain the pressure of the moment? 95%, even on tour, it's a weak link. I can almost show, you can go back in time. Greg Norman, when at the 1996 Masters, where he gave back, he was at a 6-shot lead on Nick Faldo coming down the stretch. And then his ball striking just left him. His short game didn't leave him coming down the stretch. His ball striking left him. But he actually looked at his ball striking stats at the time. He was ranked like 150th on tour out of 180 guys in terms of like his tee to green ball striking stats. What you really see happen is pressure picks away at weaknesses. And so the answer is yes, in fact, it was a choke because he played a terrible last round on Sunday. But do I sit him on a couch and talk to him about his self-talk, talk to him about his visualization, talk to him about what he was thinking in his head? Or do I fix his ball striking? Because why didn't your putting break down in the same moment? Why were you still chipping the ball unbelievably in the same moment? So if it is mental, you tend to see the mental impact go across all parts of the game. But Dustin Johnson in 2015, three putted on the 18th hole to kind of lose to Jordan Spieth. And all the talk was about, he choked, he three putted. He had just from 12 feet, he three putted at the time. But again, if you looked at his putting at the time, he was a horrendous putter. He was not a good putter going into that. On the same hole that he three putted, he hit a drive like 340 yards right down the middle. And then he hit a 5-iron from 250 yards to 12 feet. So if he's choking, why didn't he choke on those 2 shots? But he did in putting. And that's really the role I play, is trying to sort through, yes, you in fact did choke by standards, but what's underlying the cause of that? If it's mental, we're going to work on certain mental skills, but more often than not, it's not. It's usually an actual skill that is vulnerable to pressure that way. I'll draw one last parallel that Matt and Scott, you guys do that. I feel like what I do that with golf skills. I again feel like the two of you do that with someone. I do it with their golf portfolio. You do it with their life portfolio, their financial portfolio. So if I come to you and I'm anxious about finances, well, is that because of my portfolio? Is that because of my spending? Is that because of my health and my illness? Is that because I just got divorced? Is that like there's a lot of factors that come into my security in terms of my own life. I kind of am relying on someone outside of it to look at it with more clear lens and kind of figure out which of these aspects of my financial chain do I have to shore up. I feel like we do similar things in a lot of means, just with different clientele.
Yeah, there's a lot of crossover there. And I know if you have time for just maybe one more question, I know we've taken a lot of your time. So with everything that's happened in the world from the financial crisis in 2008, 7, 8, 9, COVID, inflation, working from home, politics, and everything, how do champions manage adversity, right? Because it's going to hit all of us in different ways, shape, or form, whether it's business, family, or in sports, right? All the different things. So, what are those similar strategies and tactics that you've seen that those and top level executives and in the sports world, what do they do to when they face this adversity that we're all going to face?
There's some mental things they do, and then there's some, let's call them preparation things that they do. So in the moment when they're faced, if adversity appears in the moment that they didn't expect and couldn't anticipate, I would say they do two things. One is they determine what's in their control and they control the controllable. They have the ability to kind of let, all of a sudden they get a bad tee time at the British Open. And so during the Open, you can get a bad tee time and the weather just turns horrible. It's not within your control. And so you're not going to sit there and get upset about it. You're going to recognize, hey, it's the golfing gods kind of put me on the bad side of this tee time. And then they're going to focus on opportunity. They're going to try to play the best they can against the field because we're in the same weather that way. So they stay very positive in terms of where's the opportunity within the threat, and they control what they can control. That's in the moment. What many times fans don't see is what they do behind the scenes to prepare for that moment. In other words, many things that look like adversity from a fan perspective can be anticipated. And if they can be anticipated, they prepare for it in advance. We call it transfer training. And I'll give you one last story, that a great example. The US Open's going on in New York right now. Again, it's going to show my age. Yvonne Lendl, anyone my age might know. Yvonne competed in the days of Jimmy Connors, John McEnroe, but was the dominant player of the time. He was just Czechoslovakian, so many people thought of it like McEnroe and Connors because they were American. But Yvonne was the dominant player. Yvonne to this day holds the record for the most consecutive US Open finals appearances in New York. He basically eight years in a row, he made it to the finals. He won several of them, but made it to the finals 8 years in a row. You were going to watch Yvonne Lendl play the finals of the US Open. I asked Yvonne, I said, hey, what's so special about the US Open that you're just so dominant when you get there? He looks at me and he goes, I live in Connecticut. I said, so you get to sleep in your own bed? Is that why? And he goes, no, it has nothing to do with my bed. It has everything to do with the speed of the courts. I'm like, what does Connecticut have to do with the speed of the courts? He goes, well, what you don't realize is we come off the grass season, we play Wimbledon, we exit grass and we start playing hard courts. He goes, to play well at the US Open, you have to make that adjustment because the speed of a hard court is so different than the speed of a grass court. He goes, all of us play hard court tournaments leading into the US Open in preparation for hard courts. He goes, the issue is hard courts at the US Open aren't even the same speed as hard courts at those other tournaments. He goes, so to get an advantage at the US Open, what you have to do is prepare for the hard courts there. He said, and guys like me at my ranking, I play on center court. There's also outside courts. He goes, center court is not even the same speed as the outside courts. He goes, so you really need to, at my level, understand the speed of center court and be adjusted to it. He goes, what do you think dictates the speed of center court? I said, I have no idea. He said, the amount of sand that they fold into the last layer of paint when they lay that layer of paint, that creates how much friction there is on that court. He says, so if you want to have an advantage and really prepare for the adversity of center court, he goes, you find who the crew chief is and the crew that laid center court on Tuesday, and you pay them to come to your house in Connecticut on Wednesday and do the court again in your backyard. He goes, and every year I played the US Open, I had center court rebuilt in my backyard and
Wow.
I played on it. Um, so that's just kind of an example of, I always say, so adversity, he's anticipating it. He's anticipating I'll be in center court. I'll have to adjust, but he's given himself an advantage. And he's doing that so he can see it as an opportunity when he gets there, not a threat.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating to hear. That again, to take what you would say appears to be an adversity and say, no, I'm going to turn it into an advantage for me because I have control over that. Again, you can't control everything, but those things that, like you said, you can't control the weather, right, at the Open
Right.
Championship, but you can control other things around it. So again, thank you so much. I know we've taken way too much of
No,
your
I've
time.
enjoyed it.
Really appreciate your time and expertise and insight today. And I know a lot of people are going to really find it valuable. So thank you. Thank you again very
Thanks
much.
for having me very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Alrighty, well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Rick Jensen, so appreciate him and his time today. Just a lot of great stories, a lot of interesting thoughts that we can, of course, apply, take from the world of sports and his experiences and apply them to, our personal and professional lives. Matt, why don't you tee things up for us? Pun intended there. Why don't you let us know what were some of your big takeaways from the conversation with the doc?
Sure, Ryan. He was a great guest. First and foremost, for those who don't know golf, the story he told about Dustin Johnson hitting a driver 350 and a 5 iron another 250 yards. Not normal, very impressive. So just for those who don't golf to understand that story, the idea behind that last story told about Yvonne Lendl and adversity, right? We're all going to face adversity, and we all do, but to kind of almost flip the script and say, okay, how can I almost take this adversity and say, okay, what of this can I use to my advantage or turn into something a little more positive? Not only the mindset approach of it, but saying that I'm going to, resurface my own court in my backyard. So I'm going to turn that into an advantage. And again, you could listen to all these stories, but taking those things that could be an adversity and then flipping the script on it and say, okay, how can I use this to my advantage? That was really, really interesting to hear that
Yeah.
at that level, like that's what people are doing.
Super interesting to hear. Scott, what about you? What were some of your takeaways?
Well, just with what he opened, when he opened with the stories about Greg Norman and Greg, the level of intensity that Greg Norman had at improving himself. I mean, obviously he's aware that there's other players out there, but his intense focus was on him getting better at what what he thought his weaknesses were. I thought, when we're able to do that as business owners or as parents or whatever the case might be, when we're presented with a client's situation, I think about the times that we take them through the stress test, looking for anticipating those times where there's going to be some struggle and so we're not just focusing on, hey, the market always, every 10, if we have a 10-year rolling period, they're always positive. It's focusing on, hey, what if we end up, with a long-term care event? What if we end up with a death and a person who owns a business has a liquidity event? All of these things that, can be challenges need to be part of the plan. Planning for the best, but also planning for the worst. And that's what I see, at least, in this discussion, was that the top of the top are always looking at shoring up what those weaknesses are to be ready for anything.
I love that.
I love that too, because again, there's so many times where you and I know, Scott, when we see something, it's like, well, this is working really well. Or when we meet with people or that business owner, it's like, hey, but here's some areas that if you shore this portion up, it's even going to be that much better for you and your family and the business. And then you start, as we talk about all the time, that generational impact that's going to then just be, the ripple effect from that's going to go even further and further. So what about you, Ryan? What would you take away today?
Well, yeah, no, kind of cut from the same cloth there. He had a little phrase there: pressure chips away at weakness. And I think we all knew that, but it was just really interesting to hear him utter that phrase that way because I mean I'm a golfer. We've talked about this offline, guys. I enjoy playing the game, and it does always seem to when maybe a moment comes, whether it's golf actually or not, a moment filled with pressure. It's usually the pressure is going to ultimately exploit the weaker part of your game or the weaker part of your skill set as a whole. So, yes, by shoring up those weaknesses, making sure you allocate times towards them rather than leaning into the thing that you feel good about so you can stroke your ego and pat yourself on the back. It was really nice to hear him say that and kind of kick myself in the butt a little bit to say, hey, maybe I should go work on my short game a little bit.
Yeah,
But
that's
no,
good.
it's really, really interesting to hear him some of his stories and his lessons, certainly.
Yeah, I could have talked to him for a long, long time, definitely.
Likewise, likewise. Well, guys, look, as we always do before we sign off, for anybody out there that's interested in opening up a conversation with you and your team to maybe talk further about something they heard on this show or a conversation with a guest, what would be the best way somebody can open up a dialogue with you guys and have a conversation?
Traditionally, pick up the phone, 517-333-7967, or our website, Morrison Nordman with two N's at the end.com. And you can go on there, look around, and you can click to schedule a phone call or an appointment.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate you both and your time. Again, of course, Dr. Rick Jensen with us today. Such a great conversation. Fellas, I will see you back here on the next one. Have a great day.
Thanks, Ryan. We'll see you.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right, see you guys. And hey, folks, we're going to take a final moment as we always do and thank you, our audience, for stopping by and being with us. If you enjoyed today's discussion with Dr. Rick Jensen, make sure you subscribe to the show on the platform you checked us out on today so that you don't miss out on any future conversations on this show. But for Scott, for Matt, and Dr. Rick, I'm Ryan. We're going to go ahead and say so long now, but we appreciate you being with us today on Path to Abundant Living.